This is Paul Villa with the Proteus Debate Academy. This is like my fourth time doing this, and if it doesn't work this time, I give up. You're not worth it. You're not worth it. Okay? Today's video is going to be about permutations. So we are going to be discussing why do people read counter advocacies at all, and sort of how does that relate to permutations, because there's a very clear relationship there. What are permutations and what are they not? What is a perm strategic utility? So what is the function of a perm rather than just what is a perm definitionally? What makes a permutation legitimate and illegitimate? And then some examples at the pet shop, which is my favorite part of this lecture, followed by just some thoughts I have about how permutation debate exists in college parley. So the first thing I want to discuss is, why do people read counter advocacy? So why might someone read a counterplan, or why might someone read a critique? There's broadly three reasons for this. First is that the status quo sucks or is largely indefensible. So a lot of debates come down to, especially at the higher level, sort of uniqueness and controlling the uniqueness of the debate. This is something Brenna talked about in her interview with Tanya, as far as something that she felt her and Tristan understood a lot better than other teams in the country. And obviously they won 4 natties, so that went a long way for them. But the bottom line is, if the status quo is bad, then the affirmative is likely to win on some sort of try or die claim. So the negative needs to read a counter advocacy so that they don't have to defend an indefensible status quo. The second thing is that it lets you steal offense from the affirmative team. So I tend to think of debate as like an algebra thing I learned in 5th grade, where there's like a scale, right? And we put like units on each side. The AF's impacts are their units, and a counterplan or a critique potentially lets the negative copy or steal those units from the affirmative team, which balances them out, which can be really strategic, right? You're basically zeroing out the offense of the other team. In the world of like a critique debate, the affirmative might make a impact claim that says they resolve for climate change through market-based solutions like subsidies for solar panels, and the negative could argue that no, they solve better for the climate because capitalism is the root cause of climate change and they're able to resolve for that, so that's preferable or good. The last thing is it helps us inflate the value of small net benefits. And so this tends to be most relevant when it comes to what are called PICs, or plan inclusive counterplans. That's where you do portions of the plan, but specifically exclude some part for the sake of mutual exclusivity. And so if the plan is give something to all 50 states and the counterplan is only do it for these specific 48 states or 45 states or whatever, we can now win on a relatively marginal net benefit about how those 5 states or those 2 states or whatever matter. Now, there are a lot of arguments about why PICs are bad for these reasons, but the bottom line is having an advocacy that reads functionally defense to the affirmative means we can win on a relatively smaller amount of offense. Okay, so now we're talking about permutations. What is a permutation? A permutation is an argument made by the affirmative team that can test whether the negative's counter advocacy is competitive, which we'll largely discuss in the context of demonstrating an opportunity cost, to the affirmative plan. And so we're going to discuss what I mean by competition and what I mean by opportunity cost. What is competition? There are, broadly speaking, 2 kinds of competition in debate: functional competition and textual competition. Functional competition is about the sort of like, I guess one way of thinking about it is like the substance or the implication level of the advocacy, right? So in the context of a plan and counterplan, like, what is the effect of the plan text, right? What does the fiat and hypothetical implementation of the plan versus the counterplan look like? And are those things functionally competitive? They could be functionally competitive for 2 reasons. Either A, there are some opportunity costs, which we'll cover on the next slide, a disad, a turn, a solvency deficit, etc. Or B, they are mutually exclusive, which means it's not possible to do both, like I just talked about with plan inclusive counterplans. Textual competition says that advocacies can compete on the basis of the literal words and language in the advocacy statement. So one classic example that I've seen in parliamentary debate for like a decade now is in debates about topics about Taiwan. Sometimes those topics say Taiwan, sometimes those topics say the Republic of China, sometimes they use the indigenous term for Taiwan. But you could read a plan that says Taiwan should do X. The negative could read an identical counterplan, but change out Taiwan for Republic of China, and then they can try and generate offense that says you using Taiwan was a bad word, and that as a result, even though the functions and the effects of the plan and counterplan are the same, there's still a reason to prefer the negative. Now, I would say, broadly speaking, textual competition is dumb, not a good use of your time. There's a lot of reasons that are very, well, I guess there's a lot of arguments, generally speaking, that are very easy to make about why textual competition is bad. But just as sort of an example in terms of debate balance, it's really easy to find an article that says that using a word is bad, and it's super hard to find an article that says we must use this one specific word. And so that sort of creates an imbalance in the game where even though you've done exactly the same thing as the affirmative, you just happen to have some author that has the tiniest net benefit to using that word or not. That seems stupid and bad. I care about fairness. You should too. Okay, so what is an opportunity cost then? WTF is an opportunity cost. Well, under the policy-making paradigm of debate, which is what debate operates under now, we've sort of moved away from stock issues and into a world of comparing the world of the affirmative versus world of the status quo or whatever counter-advocacy the negative reads. An opportunity cost refers to an offensive reason to prefer the status quo or the world of the counter-advocacy, i.e. there is a good impact that the AF would preclude us from achieving or a bad impact that the affirmative would cause. Two examples of this are disadvantages. Disadvantages obviously say the world is good. The AF does something that causes something bad to happen. Counterplans say that there's an alternative thing we could be doing instead, and there's some associated net benefit with that, or solvency surplus, a turn, etc., that largely does the same thing. And so when we say a permutation tests the competition, what we're saying is the permutation demonstrates that there is in fact no opportunity cost. There is no link to the offense that the negative is going for. Okay, so what is a permutation not? Permutations are not advocacies. They are tests of competitions. In function, a permutation serves the same purpose as a no link or a we meet does on theory. When you read a we meet on a theory argument, you are saying there is no link to the violation, so there is no reason to reject the affirmative. When you need a no link on a disadvantage, you are saying that impact will not happen, it should not be counted against the affirmative. That same thing is happening in the world of the permutation. It is not an advocacy. We are not literally saying we have changed our plan, it is now do both. So what makes a permutation legitimate? Well, there's two things that make it illegitimate, and that is severance and intrinsicness. So the rule of severance says that permutations must include the entirety of the affirmative plan text, i.e. you cannot sever, you cannot cut out parts of the plan text that you previously defended, whether that is in the format of planks or in function or something else. The rule of intrinsicness says you can't have anything in a permutation that was not a part of the affirmative's advocacy statement and the negative's advocacy statement. Like the total set of things we can use for our permutation come from the affirmative advocacy text and the negative advocacy text. Why would intrinsic permutations be bad? Well, if the negative can read a disad to your plan text, and then in the second affirmative speech you can come up and say, we just changed our plan text and now it links turns or no links that disadvantage, that's obviously massively advantageous and unfair to the negative. This is just for the nerds. We're staying here for like 5 seconds. This is like an algebraic, mathematic explanation of how permutations function. I thought maybe 3 of you would care about this. I'm sure there's some of you where math is your special interest, and I'm happy for you. Okay. What is the strategic utility then of a permutation? Not just what is it? What does it do? 2 things, primarily. One is that it mitigates the negative's net benefits. So in the same way that the negative read a counterplan to try and steal our units and balance that equation algebraically, us reading permutations allows us to do the same thing with their stuff. If the negative accidentally reads a counterplan that solves the net benefit, the disad that they're reading, then reading a permutation, as long as it's not competitive, ends the debate effectively for the affirmative, because now the affirmative has solved that disad, no link that disad, it goes away. They might have a solvency surplus on the negative, and so stealing parts of it could be desirable. Second is just to skill check your opponent. Perms are incredibly easy to read, even if you're doing them properly. They're still very time efficient. They are in no risk position in that you will, as far as I'm aware, pretty much never ever lose the debate because you read a permutation, other than if it took you too much time. And if the other team doesn't respond to them, you just kind of win the debate in a lot of instances, assuming they have a unconditional advocacy. And so they're very low risk, incredibly high reward. Now, the problem with how they're done in Parley is they're not really arguments, and we'll come back to that later. And so the only way you can win a perm in a lot of these debates is if the other team drops it, and that's not good, because if you can only win your argument if they don't respond to it, it wasn't a very good argument or an argument to begin with. But we'll come back to that at the very end. So, finally, we're going to go to the pet store, which is my favorite part of this lecture. This is how I would teach permutations to like a 10-year-old, but I also think it's useful for people who are older, college students, etc. So, We're at the pet store, and we've decided our plan is to get 3 pets. We're going to get an alligator, a bird, and a cat. So our plan text is A, B, C. Alligator, bird, cat. Well, our parents, our friend, our roommate, our significant other, whatever, says, how about counterplan? We get a dog and an eagle. So the counterplan text is D, E. Let's talk about all of the possible permutations you could read. 100% of the set of permutations that exist. The first legitimate permutation we could read is alligator, bat, cat, dog. A, B, C, D. Now, Miss Rachel moment here. What part of the counterplan did we choose not to include? That's right, the eagle. Now, actual debate question for not Miss Rachel fans. In a world where this was your permutation, alligator, bat, cat, dog, what is the debate now about? To win the debate, what would you have to hone in on and sort of do? You would have to read offense as the affirmative about why eagles are bad. And the negative, conversely, would be reading arguments about why eagle is necessary, eagle is desirable, etc. The debate is now about the eagle, because that is the thing that the affirmative chose not to include. Let's talk about the other 2 possible permutations. The second one is alligator, bat, cat, eagle, A, B, C, E. And the third one is alligator, bat, cat, dog, eagle. So why would we read perm 1? Because we think eagles are bad. Why would we read permutation 2? Because we think dogs are bad. And why would we read permutation 3? Because we like the entirety of the counterplan and allowed us to mitigate the maximum amount of their net benefit. But to be clear, based on the rules we've learned about severance and intrinsicness, these are the only possible permutations. Anything else would engage in severance or be intrinsic. So we're going to talk about that a bit more when we get to my opinions on things. So now that we've talked about the legitimate permutations that abide by the rule of severance and the rule of intrinsicness, let's talk about illegitimate permutations. So plan is the same. A, B, C, alligator, bird, cat, counterplan, dog, eagle. The first illegitimate perm, one that engages in severance, is alligator, bird, dog. So Miss Rachel moment, what did the affirmative team sever out of? That's right, they severed out of cat, right? The problem here being that obviously once you read that plan text, especially if that was sort of like part of the topical implementation of the plan, the negative was entitled to read offense about why cats are bad, and you've now deprived them of that option. Comparatively, an intrinsic permutation might look something like this. Alligator, bird, cat, fish. The fish is intrinsic because it was not a part of either advocacy statement that was presented in the debate. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that's unfair because you could just solve whatever offense, whatever net benefit that the negative reads if the AF gets to read new plan text in their second speech, which is also why things like vagueness are problematic. So hopefully that helps you understand on sort of visual level or an intuitive level how permutations function, what makes them legitimate, what makes them illegitimate. With that said, we're going to move away from the fun part and into things I hear in perm debates that don't make sense to me and that I don't like. First things first, I hear net benefits that aren't about the inclusion of the plan. I want to be very clear. If you find old videos of me and Dallas from junior year, we were for sure doing this. And I remember the exact moment when I became black pilled, whatever, some green, I don't know what pill would be debate exciting pilled, but we were in finals against 2 debaters and at the Lewis and Clark tournament. I know their names, I'm just not saying them for their privacy reasons. And Adam Testerman was our judge, and I read this MG, had permutations in it, and we had a net benefit. The permutation wasn't answered very well, and there was a net benefit to the permutation. And Adam Testerman was like, yeah, I just don't understand this permutation because you read a net benefit about juxtaposition or something, and I don't understand how there could be a net benefit to the affirmative world that isn't just about the inclusion of the plan. This seems to be intrinsic in effect. So the only logical benefit to any permutation relative to the counter-advocacy of the negative that is being permuted is that the plan is desirable, usually as a result of some sort of solvency surplus associated with that plan. But people still to this day in Parley read juxtaposition net benefits or say well, Judith Butler says that we have to have a plurality of ideas to solve for X, Y, and Z. Those are not offense because you are not reading an advocacy. You are reading a no link that tests the competition. You can't say, here's the impact of the no link. It's good to compare 2 things. That doesn't make any sense. It's bad. People should stop doing it if they're doing it right now. Secondarily, perms make the AF conditional. This obviously comes up when the negative is reading condo bad, conditionality bad. No, they aren't. No, they don't, rather. Perms are not advocacies. They function as no links. The AF still has to defend the desirability of a world where we do the plan in a world where we read permutations. This is like just a silly cheater argument that came about. Well, cheater's a weird way of putting it, but this is like a Berkeley argument from almost 10 years ago in debate that has sort of stuck around in a lot of perm blocks. But again, it just doesn't make sense. The AF must maintain the entirety of the affirmative. That's the rule of severance that we discussed, which means the AF is not conditional. If judges are treating this like it is an advocacy, that is a judge issue and not a debater level issue, and you should be able to explain that to them. Third, the AF gets infinite perms, which justifies negative conditionality. As you can tell, I'm a condo hack. And again, this is the Paul's opinion section. First of all, this is technically my opinion, but this is the especially Paul opinion section because obviously I'm big on condo bad and parley. This is just my opinion, but that makes no sense. Functionally, the negative is saying that because the AF can read as many no links as they want, the negative should get to defend multiple and potentially contradictory states of uniqueness. If the neg thinks perms are abusive, then they should write better counter-advocacies, which cannot be permed, right? You can have the negative defend an unconditional pick or an unconditional counterplan of some kind that's mutually exclusive and be able to win the debate if they don't want to have to deal with permutations. Now, I think the reason why this happens in parley is because the way people read perms in parley is stupid and bad, and I'll get to that on this next slide. Sometimes people say things like perm do the AF and then do the neg, or perm do the neg and then do the AF. And this is what this will look like in 80% of the national championship tournament rounds that I see permutations in. They get to the alternative and they go, okay, on the alternative, first is perm do both, next perm do the AF and then do the negative, and also the third perm is perm do the negative and then do the affirmative, and then they just start talking about the alt. As a matter of opinion, I don't think either of those are legitimate. I don't think any of those three things, even perm do both, are permutations. Permutations are intended to be arguments, and in my opinion, I also again think this is a fact, arguments at an absolute minimum are a claim and a warrant, and perm do both, perm do the AF, then do the neg, perm do the neg, and do the AF, are not a claim and a warrant, and certainly do not have an implication. They have not been explained, they do not pass a sniff test, and they're largely just being done because in parliamentary debate, the affirmative team thinks the judge will give them credence if this argument is dropped, come the PMR, that they'll get to blow it up, even though there was no actual analysis as to how that permutation tests competitiveness, how it interacts with the net benefit, why it was valuable or useful in any way. And because the affirmative in the MG gets to just read there's 7 perms or whatever in the MG really quickly with no explanation, that can feel really abusive and then sort of ends up in these conditionality theoretical debates. Why is perm do the AF and then perm do the neg and perm do the neg and then do the AF theoretically illegitimate in my opinion? Well, perm do the AF and then do the neg in my mind is a question of intrinsicness, and then do the neg is adding things, right? You have added a sort of temporal distinction here in terms of when the neg would be implemented. Similarly, perm do the perm do the neg and then the AF severs out of the quote-unquote immediacy of the affirmative. It functionally lets the AF read delay, and delay is bad because it's inherently unpredictable and it just has a bunch of other issues with it, right? I think the best can be argued to be most effective, educational, fair, etc. in a world where we're debating about the sort of implications of advocacies rather than when they would theoretically occur. And so how do you fix this if you're a young MG? I don't think it takes much longer at all to read an actual permutation text, that is, here's the part of the AF we do, here's the part of the negative we do, and then explain how that swamps the link, shields the link to the net benefit that the other team is going for. I also think the more you do that, the more you're going to be able to win a sort of reasonability debate when you're comparing to negatives with marginal net benefits, right, when it comes to some of the things we've talked about previously. But the bottom line is, I don't think these are legitimate perms. I don't think you should do them. I think you should just spend an extra 3 seconds explaining 2 or 3 perms, or you should just read one good perm for 15 seconds that can actually win you the debate. Because the bottom line is, these are only winners if the other team doesn't answer them, which means you're only going to be rewarded against teams that aren't that good to begin with, which should not be your goal. Lots of bad arguments work against people who aren't especially good at debate. So, I also think that when it comes to parley, my last problem is that because permutations are inherently defense, a lot of judges aren't willing to give us credence on them. So I think it's important that you try and have framing language surrounding the permutation debate that operates sort of at a similar level to reasonability and explains why you shouldn't be willing to vote on marginal net benefits for the negative, and that has a sort of ability to be rigorously defended come the PMR in sort of these kinds of things. I think there's too much blippy minefield debate happening in the world of permutations for both the affirmative and the negative, and that you could be a much more effective debater if you didn't approach it in that way. So, thanks for watching. Feel free to reach out to me, whether that's through DM or if you happen to have my contact information for some creepy reason, or because we're friends or whatever that might be. And thank God that I'm finally done with this video after like 2 hours of doing it.